was the first poem I wrote for my collection Speculum, and it is about Charlotte Bronte. And I didn't realise until I kind of started the collection that it's very likely that Charlotte Bronte died from hyperemesis gravidarum, which is extreme pregnancy sickness. And I was going through the same thing at the time, and so learning about her story and thinking about the alternative ways that extreme sickness can go without modern medicine sort of began the process of Speculum. So it always feels like a really important poem to me. It starts with a quote from Elizabeth Gaskell. Martha tenderly waited on her mistress, and from time to time tried to cheer her with the thought of the baby that was coming. I dare say I shall be glad sometime, she would say, but I'm so ill, so weary. Then she took to her bed, too weak to sit up. Long days and longer nights went by, still the same relentless nausea and faintness. And this is Haworth, 1855. It was there already, yes, in those bone-cold classrooms, in the chants of homo, homini, hominis, drifting out between the iron bars. But this is different. This is slow, this is fragile. This is all sighs and rustling, retching and sobs. Loneliness, I now know, is guttural. I dare say I'll be glad when it's over, but as it is, I feel like I've been cleaved. Stomach, lungs, throat frayed like a caught seam, mind spooling on the floor. Under night's cloak, beds slip their posts, sheets tie themselves in knots, pillows calcify and crumble to a fine dust. I wake each morning hot, threadbare, my linen twisted, this makeshift body kept in place by the smallest dart of nerve, this makeshift heart still in my ear. I dare say, though, that I'll be lighter in a month, but in my throat there's a bitterness that will not shift. My teeth are birds' eggs crunching under coach wheels. My tongue is torn cocoons on garden lawns. My lips, the dull skin of a cobra coiled behind museum glass. But I shall be glad sometime. I'll forget the smell of an egg yolk, the slimy warmth of butter as it runs across my tongue. I'll want other things than unripe plums and blackberries green and hard as stone. In 2 months, I'll see the white heather, the dappled breasts of merlin, shelled apple. My eyes will catch the windchat flushed and bolting from its thicket bed. In a year, I'll feel the backwards pull of a skirt hem through tangled gorse, the sharp embrace of a bramble hedge. As I lie here, soft and raw as dough, I know tomorrow will prove infinitely brighter. Even now, I can almost feel your uncut letter in my hand.
Shemaiah, it's such a pleasure to be here at University of Westminster talking to you about your poetry, your inspirations and your craft.
It's a pleasure to be here. It does.
So my first question is, your first collection, Speculum, from Broken Sleep Books, is startling and boldly explorative of the female body experience and the gendered body's position in society. How did that first collection come about?
Well, I've always been interested in writing the body. I think writing is often a really embodied experience anyway, but that book really began when I was pregnant with my first child. And I had something called hyperemesis gravidarum, which is extreme pregnancy sickness. And I was really, really ill. And it basically just sort of took away my agency, identity. I couldn't function, I couldn't read, I couldn't walk, I couldn't move. And I felt completely lost. And that kind of got me thinking about bodily agency and trying to understand the experience. And I come from a research background, so the way that I learn and understand my experiences probably by being an academic and going and learning about other people's experiences first. So once I was kind of vaguely able to read again and just even look at words on a page, I started trying to learn about HG, and Charlotte Bronte came up in the course of my research, and that was sort of it. She, as a way in of thinking about the Brontes and thinking about her potential death, and then learning more and more about the history of gynecology and the history of midwifery, and its very difficult and fraught and awful history, and a history of violence and of oppression and violence against bodies. And I think getting into that material and thinking about that material and thinking about my privilege as a white woman with access to free healthcare and someone that was able to have medication, that really drove the book, and that difficult relationship of illness and wellness and privilege and oppression that is entailed in this experience and this history of gynecology. And that's really what sort of drove it. And then I got really into looking at the Wellcome Collection's archives about female anatomy, and I just always love working with archives, and that was harrowing and interesting, and that kind of carried on. And then the Foundling Museum, and then yeah, the book just sort of happened in quite a quick rush actually. Once I'd had my daughter, it just kept going, and I kept being able to write, and it was supported by people like Nash and Suna at Poetry Birmingham. They were encouraging me to write more, and then they put me in touch with Aaron, and then suddenly there was Speculum, and there it was, and it was this kind of lovely thing that came out during lockdown. This poem is called Portrait of a Pregnant Sonnet. I love sonnets, I love the form, and I love the limited space and this idea of boxing or containment and what that body allows you to do. And I think it became a really fertile space for me when I was writing about pregnancy and the body, to think about its sonnets and to think about the pregnant body in terms of a sonnet, and the editorial process as a kind of gestation as sorts. So this is one of the lightest poems in the collection, I would say, and I always really enjoy reading it. Portrait of a Pregnant Sonnet. Think of me not as a prison, but as a beautiful house where all the doors and windows are bolted and everybody else has the key. I go to workshops to meet editors who touch my body and tell me I need to eat more words. I stay up late scrolling message boards for signs that I'm laboured, that the relationship between my form and content is all wrong. At the sonnet class, all the other sonnets know how to behave. The perfect couplets sit in a circle and smile at each other, while I just keep saying to myself that opinions are like Volta's, everybody has one. But when I go swimming, I submerge my feet, and suddenly I'm wordless, free of syntax, unformed. Diving under, I roll my body over in a question mark and exhale.
The functionality of each poem as a coherent device to deliver something that is conceptually so different and exploring so many layers of a different relationship is astounding, moving and brilliant. I would call this a prowess of visualization. There are hints of what is to come in your first collection, but how did the idea of the stunning second collection, Lapwing, published by the Liverpool University Press, come about?
Well, thank you. That was a lovely, very, very kind way of describing things. It should be said that I love sequence poems in general, and maybe because I'm not very good at just containing myself within one piece, I love how poems leak and bleed over into each other, and how actually you can tell this really interesting, alternative, very non-linear narrative with sequence poetry. But Lapwing was sort of being written at the same time as Speculum, and actually what I don't say when I talk about where Speculum came about, what also happened was that when I became pregnant with my first child, I was hit with an uncontrollable amount of grief for my father, who had died years earlier of alcoholism, and she's related to addiction. And I think having my own body out of control and being in hospital and being back in that hospital space, it really made me think about his body and think about loss of subjectivity and the ways that our bodies are taken out of our control. And weirdly, we had quite a lot of overlapping symptoms you get when you have severe pregnancy sickness, problems with your liver and your kidneys, and you do also when you're vitamin deficient, when you're struggling with addiction. So weirdly, some of the symptoms that we had overlapped, and I started thinking about him again and again, and so that started working. And then when my daughter was born, it took a chance encounter in a field with some lapwing birds and us both kind of hopping up and down that suddenly I found the shape for this collection, and it arrived very quickly. That seems to have been the pattern in a lot of my work, which I find really worrying because I'm not writing anything at the moment, but I really hope that something will plant and then I become very fixated on it. But yeah, the voice of Lapwing, I think, had been lurking for many years, really, before it found its shape in Lapwing. And then the first half of it was written with the numerical poems, and then I took a big break. And then the second half was written a few years later with Pete and the sightings, and then it was all mashed and exploded together. Because yeah, I like poems that don't have neat endings and that bleed into each other and that are messy. And so in a way, this book was written in quite a messy way around grief and around this idea of a self and a life exploded, and how we then bring those shards and those pieces slowly back together again, whilst also considering birds and our own exploded lives and the exploded lives of the non-human around us. That was all a very roundabout way of saying that it's been going on for a few years, and then I have these brief bursts of activity, and that Lapwing has sort of been nesting for a while, but that definitely there is a connection between the two books, and that also there's a archival connection as well, and that they both involve lots of research, or maybe I can hide behind lots of research while I'm writing poetry. That's my way in, I think.
I think I read maybe one or two sequences in Anthropocene, which is also I think Aaron Kent is involved with that. So I read your first book, Speculum, I think maybe about 18 months ago, and then I like to Google poets whose works kind of I enjoy, and so then I came across those, and I just wondered what is, where these poems are taking me, and so it was such a joy to sort of read this sort of I think I read it maybe late summer really, and it initially it took me 3 readings to try and get around what you were saying, but I think you do have this way of language which is just beautiful. There's an element of musicality that just threads the poems, even if you kind of read segments that are unrelated. It just feels like there's just something sound-wise, that there's something present in them that connect them.
Oh, thank you. Yes, sound is a really important piece of inspiration for me, like listening and etymology. If in doubt, I always go to etymological dictionaries and just spend ages reciting and sounding out words. And this act of naming and the power that comes with naming and linguistic relativity, the way that we're limited by the language at our disposal, and that sometimes we don't have enough of it, and that poetry has this wonderful ability to sort of stretch it, and that's what I like trying to do as well. It should be said that Anthropocene was lovely to publish those poems. That was a guest issue edited by Tom Bramford, who's a poet I really admire and who's writing really interesting environmental and ecological poetry, and he was just this big supporter of Lapwing and those particular poems. And yeah, because they sort of, I'm always really nervous about speaking about the book and the way that some poems, I feel like they all need to go together or people won't like them as singular pieces. So he was very nice to see something and support it. At the heart of Lapwing, there are a number of different sequences. There is a numbered sequence which looks at the figure of Lapwing, this flitting, very hard to pin down bird creature. There are also lots of sightings, which are from amateur ornithologists who are trying to capture, usually inevitably kill, lapwings in order to understand them. And then there are poems by Lapwing's daughter Pete, which are quite different in style and are trying to sort of make sense of this riffing bird that runs all the way through. They work as an accumulative effect, but I'm going to read the first 5 in the Lapwing sequence of kind of otherwise known as numerical poems. 1. Otherwise known as Peewit, otherwise known as Chewit, otherwise known as Vanillus vanillus of the family Charidre, otherwise known as plain old Lappy nestling itself in the till, otherwise known as Diver, found in its down in the centre of some middle of nowhere, otherwise known as Wailer, otherwise known as Waverer, as Imp, Liar, as shrill green sky, as Wader of the marsh, Slope, as Flock, as Tiresias turned and heckling the cows, otherwise known as Crown Prince, as Crest, as Sharp Throat, as Hair, otherwise known as Zigzag, Soaring, Dizzy, otherwise known as Lost. 2. Otherwise known as Green Plover, Controller of Seasons, Shaman, Crook, some skittish soul turning everything it doesn't understand into a god. God of the long grass, God of the cuckoo bird, God of the gloved hand, God of the drought, God of the estate, God of the sloping roof, God of the silver tree, God of the frost, God of the harvest, God of the metal raw, God of the spinning white, God of the crop, God of the unhatched, God of the death machine. 3. Otherwise known as nickname, posture, as totter, raked ground, Lapwing, some sly false flex, otherwise felt as a leap, as tombstone shiver, as an ever constant wince. 4. Otherwise known as Pete, 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 plumage primped and plucked to perfection, each bright tail up like a rake, breast down, peck crown, otherwise known as hollow man, as bust up, wing smacking the green fool that even thinks to try his luck in these parts. Territory as self-expression, otherwise known as belonging, Pete, 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 otherwise known as showman, as feathers, all dives and rolls and tumbles in time to his spring song, swan song, his own peas weep, weep, otherwise known as seduction. 5. Birds have their demons too, otherwise heard as diversions. From the Latin to draw or drag apart, Peewit has his ways of flitting, of feigning each intended cry. Drink, violence, no sense of direction, reneging on a promise to mate for life, insolence, otherwise known as a deceit. For every short, sharp Pete, 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 there are 10 chewits that never catch the wind. Here's one with a temper under his wing. Come cat, he shrieks, come fox, come man with his sharp tang and featherless glove, come cuckoo, come endless sound, come parch, come hunger, come pluck, come blunt serrated edge, come raging monster blocking out the clouds.
How did poetry start for you? Do you remember the very first poems?
I remember writing limericks with my granddad when I was a kid. I used to live with my grandparents or spend a lot of time with them, and he used to be really into writing limericks together, so I did a lot of those, very bad limericks on his typewriter, because I just really wanted to practice on his typewriter. And I wrote a couple of poems when I was at primary school, and I used to really love it, but then I stopped And I think I didn't really start writing poetry again until I was at university, and then I wrote some really horrific poems, really, really bad stuff. But I started studying poetry again then and just falling in love with it. And I probably started wanting to be a poet when I was a postgraduate student at the University of Leeds, and I started volunteering at a magazine called Stand, which is a really long-running, since 1952, I'll get tested on that, magazine of the arts, and they amazingly let me help and read all the submissions and take part in the editorial process and do all the typesetting, and that got me into writing because they also sort of nudged me and got me editing and got me producing poetry for a group. It's called John Whale and John Glover, the two editors at the time, and they were just brilliant, and they got me thinking that I might become a poet, and that's really when I started. So maybe around the time that all the stuff around my dad was happening, that was when I also started at Stand. So I think that kind of all came together. So yeah, 21, and then it took me another like 10 years to then sort of admit that I wanted to write a book and do that. So it's been a long process, and I was definitely a slow and a little bit dodgy beginner. Lapwing is a book about a bird, and it's a book about lapwings and language, but it's also a book about difficult relationships and addiction and trying to love someone and understand someone who seems to do their best to not be loved and not understood, and the difficulties that come with loving someone and trying to care for someone who is ill and who is suffering and who is desperate to evade capture. So this poem is from the perspective of Pete, Lapwing's daughter, and it comes amidst this charming kind of voice of the lapwing flitting here and there, and it's called On the Difficulty of Care. They once found him lulled beneath the concrete base of the pylon, raggedy feather, rucked in leaf mould and mess, smell of abandoned nest caught in the grass, green feather almost a pure dull. Pete, leaning in close enough to hear his heart's violent thrum against the steady gust of each commuter. Lapwing, otherwise known as Chewit, remains where he tucks, body ringed by the offerings of his brood, proffered cranefly, larvae, a dozen wetland mollusks rotting into a single organism, slug, bloated and floating backwards in the waterlogged rut. Indifference, otherwise justified as the quick nipping of pain in the bud, pulls her to a safe distance. Let the pylon loom, she thinks. Let him kite himself across this metal nation. Let the A-road keep us forever severed. A safe acreage between them. Let him fashion his own flight home. Let him disintegrate. Love held in leagues. Love wrapped in steel and power cables. Love in concrete wings.
I wanted to ask about the importance of professional writing, which is your present academic focus as an educator, and whether aspiring poets who are working on their language and voice may also benefit from learning about different styles and modes of writing.
I think it's always good to be reading and engaged in all types of authorship, and also thinking about being a writer not just as that one person writing a book, but the fact that every book takes loads of different people. It's always a collaboration of sorts, isn't it? That's sort of what I do on this MA that I run that's called professional writing, but I still really, I teach professional writing. I also mostly teach creative writing as a lecturer, but even now I don't fully know what it means, because I think to be a professional writer is to be really someone just engaged with language, and we're all doing that. But yes, I think being on the other side of stuff and editing and learning how to edit really well is so important to your own development as a writer, because you you're able to read in different ways and you're able to see what works and what doesn't, and that absolutely helps when you then go back and look at your own stuff, and you can hopefully start to apply those ideas. So yeah, and also just even making a magazine or making a zine, and that process of putting something together and ordering and collecting and asking your friends for things and creating community around all being creative, that's also vital and lovely and hands-on and practical, so that you're not just writing poems, and there's nothing wrong just writing poems, but I like using your hands, and I like being practical, and so I think any way you can to sort of go on the other side of just being alone in your room writing a poem and to bring it out into the world is a really valuable and important thing. And yeah, I'm always forcing my students, not forcing, I'm strongly encouraging them to come along to readings and to get involved in editing each other's stuff, to set up zines, to come and zine with me, to make magazines, because that was so vital for getting me passionate about it, was as a reader and as someone working at Stand and volunteering and then being an editor at a student magazine called Poetry and Audience. I don't think I would be where I am. Well, I know I wouldn't be where I am without volunteering my time and just spending hours and spending my Friday nights reading other people's work and going, oh wow, that's amazing. I'm gonna typeset that now. So yeah, super important.
This is exactly what my poetry mentor, Zoe Brigley, the Poetry World's editor, defines as poetry citizenship.
And, yeah, it's lovely.
Encouraging aspiring poets and kind of poets within any stage of their career to take an interest in being a community-oriented person.
Absolutely. Yeah, I totally agree, because it can be a really isolated and isolating process, writing, especially if you're having a bad day or you spent a whole day working on a comma and then you've decided to put it back in again at the end. And actually what poetry does really well, I think, is have a lovely community, and we can make a really good gig whether there's 500 people or 5 people. And I love that about poetry, that everyone's just really passionate and keen and just wants to celebrate each other. So if you can get involved in any way, whether that's watching it, listening to it, coming along to your first poetry reading, making a little magazine that you then give to your friends and distribute, it is part of that citizenship, and it's that generosity, because we all need to be generous with each other, and we're all starting from somewhere, and we're all on the same thing, just at different stages. So yeah, and we've all got stuff to learn still.
Absolutely. I wanted to ask a question about Lapwing, and what is this music I hear all through, Lapwing, but also in your earlier work? Is there kind of, is there any genre or anything that, that's inspired you?
There's a lot of sonic inspiration in Lapwing. Also because I was spending a load of time just listening to birdsong over and over as I was walking, and just bird calls, and that bird call just started riffing. And I'm a big fan of jazz music and folk music, and I sang a lot when I was younger. So I was classically trained, and I did lots of singing and lots of jazz and folk, and I've stopped doing it now, so I think I just live out my dream vicariously in poetry. But Lapwing definitely plays on this idea of a riff and of this repeating note, and the way that you can take a word, just like you might take a standard or a very popular song, and then just roll it around again and again and pull it apart and put it back together again. So it's meant to be very jazzy, and it's meant to be this sort of improvisation on the idea and the sounds of Lapwing all the way through, and that each, particularly the sequences, they're almost like a song, and they're trying to have that sonic quality of a jazz riff on an idea or on a word. This poem is written from the perspective of Pete, the daughter of Lapwing. On waking, hawk hovers and falls from the firmament. Pete, roosting in dawn frost, thinks of mornings spent enveloped in the cotton womb of her grandparents' bed. Grief, she thinks, is just an inflammation of memory, a fine tendon slowly ripping itself from wingtip to beak.
Who are the poets and writers from the past and present to have inspired your writing?
Oh, I always find this question really hard because then I can't remember anyone. You know, it's that weird thing when you're put on the spot and you suddenly can't think of anyone and you're like, Shakespeare. But there are some key influences when I was first starting, and I think they are in Lapwing still. So Geoffrey Hill was a really vital influence for this book, and just for all of my work. I did my PhD on him, and he loved a sequence and he loved archaeological writing, and yeah, I think Mercy and Hymns, that collection, is definitely in Lapwing in different ways. Tony Harrison, again, I read a lot and wrote on a lot. But also David Daberdeen, his poem Turner was fantastic, and I think that might have been one of the best long poems I'd read when I was first starting to study poetry, and I just thought, oh, you're allowed to do this. This is brilliant. And Anne Stevenson and Miroslav Holub, and the forensic nature of his work, and before and after, and the way he approaches things like a scientist in his poetry and just picks his subject apart, I think is amazing. And then contemporary, oh my God, there are just so many, and it depends on the day. I spend all my money on poetry books these days. I work on Regent Street, and it used to be when I first started here that my big problem was buying clothes, but that's not a problem. I don't care about that anymore. What I do spend on is the Poetry Pharmacy, which is just down the road from where I work, and so I spend too much money on books. The books that I'm currently really inspired by are, there's Banu Kapil, who remains an inspiration, and she's published by Pavilion Poetry as well, which is sort of lovely. And I mentioned Tom Bramford. I think his collection Bore, his pamphlet Bore with Broken Sleep, is brilliant, and I've read what he's been working on is just fantastic. Rashika Wick has just brought out a really good collection called Horse, which I love. But as I was working on this book, I was trying to make a list of the people that I was reading, and it would be Rebecca Tomash, Witch, I think is an amazing sequence, Karen McCarthy Wolfe, Seasonal Disturbances, Darren Rees-Jones, my editor. I sort of adore her as an editor, but also as a poet, and her books with Seren are fantastic. Anne Carson, Fran Locke. Now, there's someone who can do a sequence, and the way that she can maintain these creatures and these voices and just these anarchic presences in her books, I just adore. Terence Hayes and this continuation of the sonnet, and again, trying to think about almost riffing on a topic. I love his sonnets. Claudia Rankin, Alice Notley, they're all just really good at sequences, and I think I did read a lot of them as I was writing Lapwing, but at a distance. I sort of tried to keep my distance a little bit, and then after the book was done, then I got to indulge in them again and just relish these beautiful books. And then Juliana Spahab, I think her ecological work is amazing, and Donmi Choi, and the way these archives are being brought into DMZ Colony is just fantastic. Jason Allen Pissant, Hannah Sullivan. Yeah, there are too many. There are so many good poets. Jiffa Benson's Monster, which has just come out, the way that she's using archives is just so exciting, and it's this beautiful Blood Axe book that's too big, and I love it, and I love how it is sort of pushing at the edges of the page and doing all these interesting things. I could go on. There are just so many that are important. Poetry is important. I very rarely read the sightings that run all the way through the books. They're found poems to an extent. Some of them are taken from the Orc magazine, which is it's still going, but a 19th century birding journal, and from newspaper articles that had mentions of lapwings and finding lapwing eggs for sale. And I can't resist this archival sort of bent in my work, where I love having found material, and these run through the book, but I very rarely read them aloud. They're really special to me, and they're really important. So it would be the sightings. So I'll read one now, and they're an attempt to think about how it's not only me as a poet trying to capture, and maybe by capturing take away some of the movement and the life of Lapwing. it's that as human beings we try and capture birds, creatures, the non-human plants as a way of understanding them, but so often that entails killing them, and it entails stuffing them and mounting them and putting them in museums to appreciate. And that's what came across again and again, was going through all these different sightings of lapwings over the years. It inevitably always ended with a date that they were shot, and that really struck me, that this capturing entails death and it entails destruction, and that seems to be a kind of a human tendency. So they have a very important environmental function within the book, I think. So this sighting of lapwing was from Shemya, Alaska, 2006. Loitering near the military base in October, flushed at 60 meters. As he became airborne, uttered a sharp call. Pigeon-like size, dark plumage, large paddle-shaped wings, and crest identified him unmistakably. Last seen circling a bar in Northern Europe. Last seen nesting in Mongolia. Flew 200 meters to the west and landed in deep beach grasses adjacent to a sewage treatment pond. Stalked and collected. 52 degrees, 43 north, 174, 7 east. Archived as a study, skin and partial skeleton with 2 frozen genetic samples. And I've got all these sightings and these kind of ornithological sightings running through, but a lot of the attempts that Pete has, this not quite me figure of the book, that's done through sound rather than sight. So hearing lapwing in dreams, hearing lapwing in ASMR, like when you're going to sleep, hearing lapwing in meditation material and listening to bird song to try and doze off. And this idea that not only when someone is lost to you, you see them everywhere, but you hear their voice as well, and you hear their call. So this poem is it's a hearing rather than a sighting. The burst water pipe spills its flood, edges ever closer, and still nothing. Pete, second offspring, midnight insomniac, panic tweeter, dissembler, squirms within the confines of the dirty nest. Lapwing, otherwise known as missing, last heard on a deleted voicemail from 10 years ago. Last heard the night before at the 37-minute mark of the birdsong ASMR. His questioning second note waking her from light sleep. He's still working then. A nerve tingle, an electric jolt of recognition before nothingness settles back into the narrow band of nerve around her skull. Voice of lapwing, fading into barn owl, fading into blackbird, fading into robin, fading into advert, fading into acrylic fingernails tapping against a dry bar of soap, fading into a wet mouth wordlessly opening and closing, fading into an endless cave of white noise.
Are you working on any exciting writing projects at present?
I'm working on writer's block a little bit, and also trying to not freak out about it and just enjoy the book and sort of remember that it will come back. But actually, I've got some really lovely things happening in the new year, so I'm going to be collaborating. I can't say too much at the moment, but doing a nice collaborative project with a poet who I really admire, for a project I really admire, so that's exciting. And thinking still about ecological writing and eco-writing and how writing can be sustainable and poetry can talk to these issues and collaborate on these issues. I'm also going to be potentially working with a jazz group as well to do some improvising across different media, which will be great. And then, yeah, just trying to find the time, I think, to take myself away and do some writing from scratch. I've got lots of ideas and lots of things I want to do, but I teach a lot, and this year has been really busy and there's been loads of exciting things about Lapwing, which has been great. And so I'm looking forward to maybe trying to carve out a bit of space in the new year to read lots of poetry again and try and read some theory and get some ideas for some stuff that's there that needs a bit more time. Yeah.
Right. Well, good luck with the T.S. Eliot Prize readings.
Thank you very much.
And diolch yn fawr, thank you very much for talking to me about your poetry and passions.
Oh, thank you for having me on this series. I really appreciate it. It's been a pleasure.